King Piye, the great Nubian conqueror of Egypt. He stands at the gates of his palace in 747 BC. Powerful kings from the Delta have come to surrender to him. They offer gold. They offer horses. They bow in the dust. But Piye refuses to let them inside, not 1 foot across the threshold. Why? Because they ate fish. To the pharaoh, they were filthy, unclean, abominations. For 3,000 years, the most advanced civilization on Earth lived on the banks of a river teeming with life. They built pyramids. They mapped the stars. But the elite, the holy, and the powerful often refused to touch the one food source that could save them from starvation. And when they finally told the world why, the reason was terrifying. This is the story of the Nile's forbidden harvest. And it's stranger than anyone told you. Close your eyes and picture ancient Egypt. You see the golden sands. You see the Great Sphinx. But mostly, you see the river. The Nile is the beating heart of the empire. It is a massive blue artery pumping life into a dead desert. In the ancient world, this river was so thick with fish that early travelers claimed you could almost walk across their backs. Tilapia, the size of dinner plates. Massive Nile perch weighing 200 pounds. Catfish that could feed a family for a week. It was a biological explosion of protein. In a world where starvation was always one bad harvest away, this should have been paradise. A never-ending buffet. But here is what the history books often skip. If you look closely at the banquet tables of the pharaohs in the Old Kingdom, something is missing. You see heaps of roasted goose. You see leg of beef. You see mountains of figs, grapes, and pomegranates. You see jugs of beer and wine. But you rarely see fish. In fact, in the most sacred texts, fish are not food. They are threats. Imagine living on the edge of the world's greatest fishery and starving to death rather than casting a net. This is the paradox that puzzled the Greeks. It baffled the Romans. Why would a civilization obsessed with food, a people who invented foie gras and force-fed hyenas just to see if they tasted good, turn their backs on the most abundant resource they had? The answer isn't simple allergy. It isn't taste. It lies in a dark intersection of biology, mythology, and a desperate need for purity in a dirty world. To understand this ban, you have to understand the ancient Egyptian mind. To them, the water of the Nile was the bloodstream of the god Osiris, and the creatures swimming in it, they weren't just animals, they were potential monsters. The silence in the archaeological record is deafening. We have found thousands of mummified cats, mummified ibis birds, mummified crocodiles. But mummified fish in royal tombs? They are incredibly rare, almost non-existent in certain dynasties. It is as if the elite were trying to erase the creature from their afterlife entirely. So how did the master, architects of the ancient world, survive without the river's bounty? To understand the severity of this taboo, you have to sit at the dinner table of a high-ranking Egyptian noble in Thebes. The year is 1300 BC. You are a guest of a vizier. The heat outside is brutal, 40 degrees in the shade. Servants fan you with ostrich feathers. The air smells of roasted garlic and baking bread. The table is groaning under the weight of the feast. But there is a strict hierarchy of protein here. For the rich, meat meant land animals, specifically cattle. Beef was the gold standard of the Egyptian diet. It was the food of the gods, the preferred offering at the temple. Priests would slaughter massive bulls, burning the choice cuts for Amun-Ra and distributing the rest to the temple staff. If you were eating beef, you were civilized. You were powerful. You were pure. If beef wasn't available, you ate birds. The marshes of the delta were black with waterfowl, pintail ducks, geese, quails, pigeons. The Egyptians were masters of fowling. They would go out into the reeds with throw sticks and bring back dozens of birds to be roasted with honey and cumin. And then there was bread and beer, the two pillars of life. The Egyptians consumed bread in quantities that would shock a modern carb-phobic diner. They had over 40 different words for bread and cakes: spiral loaves, conical loaves, sweet cakes fried in fat. They drank thick, nutritious beer that was more like a gruel than a lager. But look at what isn't there. In this sweltering heat, fish spoils fast. A dead Nile perch left in the sun for an hour begins to rot. In a time before refrigeration, before ice, a fish was a ticking time bomb of bacteria. The smell of a fish market in the Egyptian summer would have been overpowering, nauseating. For the elite, who bathed 5 times a day and shaved their entire bodies to avoid lice, the stench of fish was the scent of poverty. It was the smell of the muddy worker, the peasant waist-deep in the silt. To eat it was to lower yourself, but it wasn't just about snobbery. It was about survival. The upper classes had noticed something. People who ate raw or undercooked fish from the stagnant pools left by the receding flood often got sick. They grew weak. They coughed up blood. Parasites, flukes, tapeworms. The Nile was life, yes, but it was also full of invisible killers. So the elite walled themselves off. They created a culinary apartheid. The rich ate what flew in the air or walked on the land. The poor ate what lurked in the mud. But this social divide was nothing compared to the religious terror that was coming. This is where the story turns from a dietary preference into a holy war. To understand why a pharaoh would refuse to touch a fish, you have to go back to the beginning of time. You have to go to the most important story in Egyptian mythology, the murder of Osiris. Osiris was the first king of Egypt, a golden god of order and civilization. But he had a brother, Seth. Seth was the god of chaos, storms, and violence. In a fit of jealous rage, Seth didn't just kill Osiris. He butchered him. He hacked his brother's body into 14 pieces and scattered them all over Egypt. Isis, the wife of Osiris, was devastated. She transformed into a bird and flew across the land, desperate to find the pieces of her husband. She found his hand in one town, his head in another. Piece by piece, she reassembled the first mummy. But there was one piece missing, the most vital piece for a king who needed to create an heir: his phallus. Isis searched the riverbanks. She dredged the mud, but it was gone. And then she saw why. 3 fish were swimming in the river: the Lepidotus, the Phagris, and the most infamous of all, the Oxyrhynchus. They had eaten it, the penis of the god, the source of divine life. It had been devoured by a fish. This moment changed Egyptian theology forever. The fish became the ultimate symbol of impurity. It had consumed the divine power of the pharaoh. It was a vessel of Seth's chaos. To eat a fish was, in a symbolic way, to engage in the final destruction of Osiris. It was cannibalism of the god's essence. The city of Oxyrhynchus was actually named after this fish, the sharp-nosed fish. In that specific city, the fish was sacred, but not in the way a cow was sacred. It was sacred like a radioactive isotope is sacred, powerful, dangerous, and not to be touched. In other cities, the hatred for these fish was intense. There are accounts of civil wars starting between cities because one city ate the fish that the other city worshipped. It was madness. The fish became a magnet for religious hysteria. The Oxyrhynchus fish, likely a type of ormeirid or elephant fish, has a strange, long snout. It looks alien. To the ancient priests, it looked like a creature that didn't belong in the natural order. And because it had eaten the god's manhood, it was forever tainted. This myth seeped into the subconscious of the culture. If you were a king, a living Horus, how could you eat the creature that castrated your father? It was spiritually impossible. By the time the Greek historian Herodotus visited Egypt around 450 EC, this religious trauma had hardened into strict law. Herodotus was an outsider. He was nosy. He asked uncomfortable questions, and he was fascinated by the Egyptian priests. He wrote, "They wash themselves in cold water twice every day and twice every night. They shaved their eyebrows. They wore only linen, never wool, because animal hair was unclean." And then he dropped the bombshell. Fish they are not allowed to taste. Not just avoid. Forbidden. The priests of ancient Egypt were the guardians of cosmic order, or Ma'at. Their bodies were temples. They had to be pure vessels for the gods to inhabit during rituals. A priest who had eaten fish was considered blocked. The smell of the fish on his breath would offend the gods. The Puot. Heaviness in his stomach would weigh down his spirit. In the temples of the Old and Middle Kingdoms, we find victory steles and offering lists. They list thousands of loaves of bread, thousands of jugs of beer, hundreds of oxen. But fish, mites, zero. You could not bring a fish into the temple of Amun. It would be like bringing a pig into a mosque or a synagogue today. It was spiritual contamination. There were even specific days in the calendar, unlucky days, where the prohibition extended to everyone. The calendar of Cairo, a papyrus listing lucky and unlucky days, warns people not to eat fish on certain dates because it is the abomination of the god. But here is the shocking part. The rules weren't the same everywhere. Egypt was long. It stretched from the Mediterranean to deep Africa. In the Delta, where life was practically aquatic, the rules were looser. But in Upper Egypt, in the religious heartland of Thebes, the ban was ironclad. This created a strange class of fish-eaters. It became a slur. If you ate fish, you were signaling that you were not part of the spiritual elite. You were a belly server, a person of the mud. The priests weaponized this. They used diet to separate themselves from the masses. You eat the scavenger of the river. We eat the cattle of the fields. It was a way of saying, we are closer to the gods than you. And this segregation didn't just stay in the temples. It spilled over into politics. It shaped the rise and fall of kings. The most dramatic moment in this history, the moment that proves how serious this taboo really was, happened in the 8th century BC. Egypt had fractured. The country was split into petty kingdoms. The north was ruled by a chaotic mix of Libyan warlords and local princes. Down in the south, in Nubia, modern Sudan, a king named Piye watched this chaos with disgust. Piye was a traditionalist. He worshipped Amun. He followed the old ways better than the Egyptians themselves. He decided to invade Egypt, not to destroy it, but to save it from its own impurity. He marched north. His army was unstoppable. He crushed the coalition of northern warlords. One by one, they came to surrender. We have the actual text of what happened next. It is carved onto the victory stele of Piye, a massive slab of granite found at Jebel Barkal. It is one of the most detailed military records of the ancient world. 4 kings come to submit to Piye. They are powerful men. They wear the Uraeus serpent on their brows. They are royalty. But Piye looks at them with absolute contempt. The text says, "They did not enter the king's house because they were unclean and eaters of fish, which is an abomination to the palace." Imagine the scene. These are kings. They have traveled hundreds of miles to beg for their lives, and Piye leaves them standing in the dirt outside the palace gates because their breath smells of fish. Only one man, King Namlot, was allowed inside. Why? The stele tells us, because he was pure and did not eat fish. This wasn't just hygiene. This was a political statement. Piye was declaring that the northern kings had lost their right to rule because they had abandoned the purity laws of the ancestors. They had become like the commoners. By eating fish, they had desecrated their royal bodies. This event cemented the fish taboo as a mark of true royalty. For centuries after Piye, to be a true pharaoh meant rejecting the river's harvest. It was a symbol of discipline. It showed that you controlled your appetites. You didn't just eat whatever swam by. You ate what the gods ordained. But while Piye was playing high-stakes politics with his diet, millions of ordinary Egyptians were quietly ignoring him. Because when you are hungry, theology matters less than survival. While the pharaohs turned up their noses, the workers who built their tombs were having a barbecue. Let's travel to the village of Deir el-Medina. This is the town where the artisans who dug the Valley of the Kings lived. These were not slaves. They were highly paid professionals. They could read and write. And thanks to the garbage dumps they left behind, we know exactly what they ate. Archaeologists digging through the debris of Deir el-Medina found thousands of fish bones, catfish, perch, tilapia. The workers didn't care about the Osirian myth. They needed protein to swing hammers and chisel granite for 10 hours a day. The state actually paid them in fish. Ration lists from the village show massive deliveries of salted fish and dried fish arriving from the delta. This reveals the double life of ancient Egypt. There was the official religion practiced by the 1% in the stone temples, and then there was the real religion practiced by the 99% in their mud brick homes. The common people had a workaround. They knew the fish were impious because of the Osiris myth, so they just didn't eat that specific fish. They avoided the Oxyrhynchus or the Lepidotus, but they happily ate the tilapia. In fact, the tilapia was seen differently. It was a symbol of rebirth because it carries its eggs in its mouth. But there was one time of year when everyone, perhaps even the strict priests, looked the other way. The festival of Shemu. Shemu was the spring festival, the harvest season. It dates back to at least 2700 BC. It was a celebration of life, fertility, and the river. And the centerpiece of this festival, salted fish. The Egyptians were masters of preservation. They would gut the fish, pack them in layers of salt from the Natron Valley, and let them ferment in the sun. This process killed the parasites. It killed the bacteria. It turned the dangerous, unclean fish into a stable, salty staple that could last for months. It was the ancient equivalent of sushi, but funkier, stronger. This salted fish became the bridge between the sacred and the profane. It was the one way to eat the river without dying. And remarkably, this specific tradition was so strong that no pharaoh, no foreign conqueror, and no new religion could kill it. Empires rise and fall. Gods die. Languages vanish. But food is eternal. If you go to Egypt today, in the 21st century, you will see something incredible. Every spring, on the Monday after Coptic Easter, millions of Egyptians spill out into the parks and gardens. They are celebrating Sham el-Nessim. The name has changed slightly from the ancient Shemu, but the ritual is identical. They eat green onions. They eat lettuce. And they eat fesik. Fesik is fermented, salted gray mullet. It has a smell that can clear a room. It is pungent, gray, and to the uninitiated, terrifying. Every year, the Egyptian Ministry of Health issues warnings. Don't eat the fesik from unlicensed shops. It can cause botulism. It can kill you. And every year, millions of people ignore them and eat it anyway. Why? Because this is the taste of history. This is the taste of continuity. When a modern Egyptian bites into that salty fish, they are performing a ritual that is 4,500 years old. They are defying the ancient priests and the modern doctors simultaneously. The fish that Piye refused to touch, the fish that Herodotus called forbidden, the fish that ate a god. It won in the end. It survived the Persian conquest. It survived the Greeks. It survived the Romans, the Arabs, the Ottomans, and the British. The pharaohs are gone. Their palaces are dust. The priests who called the fish abomination are silent in the sand. But the fish remains. So why did the ancient Egyptians refuse to eat fish? The answer is a mirror of their entire civilization. It was a battle between the ideal and the real. Ideally, they wanted to be pure beings of light, untouched by the chaotic, muddy decay of the river. They wanted to separate themselves from the animal world, to reject the creature that dared to consume a god. They built a wall of prohibition to prove they were masters of their own nature. But reality always wins. The Nile was too generous to be ignored. The hunger of the people was too strong to be suppressed by a myth. Here is the final irony. The pharaohs spent their fortunes trying to become immortal. They built mountains of stone to preserve their bodies forever. They refused the corrupting fish to keep their souls pure. Yet the only thing that truly survived from their daily lives, the only living, breathing, tasting piece of their culture that you can still experience today, is the very thing they tried to ban. The pyramids are empty. The temples are ruins. But the salted fish is still on the table. History, it turns out, has a sense of humor. And sometimes it tastes a lot like salt.